the summary of the 10 obfuscators. Okay. And let's see, what have we got? Yeah, I've got to tell you about that. And then I said last time I'd pass out a non-legal type example of empirical evidence, which is highly persuasive. You'd have to be a lunatic or feeble-minded not to be persuaded by it, I think. And yet I haven't a clue how you would write any kind of an algorithm of inductive inference. It's from Snyder's Principles of Heredity, 1951. So it was a couple of years before the big Crick and Watson breakthrough. When I took genetics in 1940, Snyder's was the book first edition was the one we were using. The proof of the hypothesis that Mendelian genes are carried on the chromosomes. And it's very nice, very nicely laid out. That's a special kind of interesting argument in science, showing an isomorphism leading to an identity. That is, if you've got X's and Y's and Z's that are here and here and here and here and here in the nomological net, then you've got phi's and psi's and gammas over here that are in the same damn place in the net, then unless you're going to multiply and say, well, there's a parallel spook goes along with the first one, why not identify them? That's the core of the argument. Then, on the subject of clinical and statistical prediction, a paper that I read at the APA convention in Toronto in 1985, causes and effects of my disturbing little book. Now, this paper begins and ends with some very personal things about Meehl's life history and who influenced me and stuff like that. And you mustn't think that's just my narcissism. The organizer, Dr. Blashfield, said to the participants, don't come in and make another literature review of this damn question. We know how it comes out. I want to know, and the people want to hear people who have been active in that controversy it was kind of a celebration. It was the 30th anniversary of the book. And what we want to hear about is how you got into this hassle, why it turned you on, what you think, was it a waste of time to have spent your time writing papers on it or doing research on it, and stuff like that. So that explains the highly personal character of it. The other people did the same thing. My arch opponent, Bob Holt, did the same thing and said how he felt sad and Meehl had done in psychodiagnosis, me of all people doing it in, but that was what he said. And similarly, Ted Sarbin. So that explains the personal flavor of it. Now, as Albert Ellis says, we must remind ourselves that humans are fallible, even us. That's the papal or royal we I'm using. The blurb I passed out about the 10 obfuscators has a numerical error on page 3. If you look at line 3 on page 3, where it says of the 50 minus studies, if you read this, you may have wondered where this crazy number 41 came from. It didn't come from anywhere. And it should be 50. 0.51 times 0.51 times 50 it should read. And that means that instead of 11 submitted and accepted, it should be 13 submitted and accepted. Which makes the box right below erroneous. The box right below should read 50 divided by 50 plus 13 instead of 11, which means that it should be 79% successes. And then, as a result, at the bottom of the page, line 3 from the bottom, that changes 8% different to 5% different. So the effect is quite harmless. It makes the argument even stronger, makes the difference between the appearance of the true theories and the appearance of the false theories even less than it was. Sorry about that. All right. I'm going to finish the topic of clinical and statistical prediction today if it kills me, so that Dr. Licken can come in the fall. Lest I forget, the publications on my publication list that deal directly or sometimes tangentially with that issue are those. It looks like a bad case of overpublishing, but it was, in fact, each time a new argument that somebody had made, or by invitation, or some further empirical work that I or students of mine had conducted. Those are the studies by P.E. Meehl that deal with clinical actuarial prediction, or something very close to it. Okay, now last time I had been talking about the fact that the methodological point that you must distinguish between the kind of data and the mode of combining data, and that it's a serious mistake to mix those up. And despite the fact that in the first chapter of the book I laid that out loud and clear, a large percentage of people on both sides of the argument, for some strange reason, have seen fit to ignore that, and to some I am quoted constantly as Meehl believes, apparently, that psychological tests are more valid than any other kind of data. I never have made such an assertion in anything I've published, partly because I don't know that I believe that. For some things I certainly disbelieve it, and for other things I would be in doubt. The book is not about tests. The book is about modes of putting evidence together, whatever evidence you have. Tests, ratings, behavior samples, track record, the things that you would find in a hospital chart once you code it, social impact, things like that. So that one can have, in a typical prediction situation in psychology or sociology, we are likely to have both psychometric and non-psychometric data available. We'll have some tests like an IQ score and a multiphasic or a CPI or a Rorschach, and then we'll have some facts. The patient was arrested by the police for screaming in the theater, or this person has flunked out of law school twice, or this person's been married 5 times, or here are the ratings he received as an officer candidate from his peers, here are the ratings he got from his subordinates. And given a fixed body of data, psychometric and non-psychometric, the question being raised here is, how do you go about arriving at a judgment about the future, or sometimes concurrent statement about personality traits? It doesn't have to be future in time, although usually it will be. In a practical context, it will usually be prediction, but not always. And in psychoanalysis, of course, one of the interesting problems is that of post-diction. That is, can you post-dict something? Freud, in the early days, before he decided not to monkey with the relatives because it was hopeless, used to try to track down some of his inferences about the patient's past, things that had happened in childhood, and check with people to see whether they, what he had inferred from the associations and from the dream material could be corroborated independently. So the question is, how do we combine this mess of data for arriving at a predictive judgment? And the standard way, as I said last time, is to think about it, or if there are other people involved in the team, to talk about it. And out of that reflection in which you can take account of all sorts of things. You may take account of certain percentages that you have learned. So you may rely in part upon statistics that are known in your field. You may even grab a book and look up a statistic for that matter, although I have seen it happen very rarely in case conferences. You combine your knowledge of research evidence, so-called hard data, with your clinical experience, with some amount of theory. That will depend on the predictive domain as to what amount of faith you have in the theory that would be relevant. And if you're one kind of psychologist, your position might be, as my teacher Hathaway was, for example, theories about the mind are so crummy and poorly validated that you should almost never pay any attention to any theoretical consideration. Whereas, obviously, if I made a Michigan PhD concentrating mainly on psychoanalytic interpretation of the Rorschach, I would pay a very large amount of attention to theoretical considerations in psychodynamics. Other people would be somewhere in between. Most clinical psychologists that I run into in this neck of the woods are somewhere in between. That is, at certain points they will take account of some theoretical consideration, and other points they will say, we don't have much of a theory at all about this type of condition, but we do know from experience that these people are a very bad bet for individual psychotherapy, so let's monkey around with that. If there are intermediate, there are cases where what you take into account would be hard to classify as to whether they're factual or theoretical. For instance, in a case conference where you have a problem of differential diagnosis, schizophrenia and affective disorder, and a resident says the patient's mother, okay, a first-degree relative, was hospitalized at Hastings State Hospital for several months 10 years ago, and then you ask the resident what was the diagnosis, and he hasn't bothered to find out. Typical. That's somewhat discouraging, because if the mother was diagnosed as schizophrenia, then you can either argue on a theoretical ground that of your view of schizophrenia, or you can say, no, I don't even have a clear model as to whether it's a big gene or two big genes or polygenic or with a threshold or what, but I just know as a matter of the statistics about the risk. And if I know the mother was diagnosed schizophrenia by a halfway competent staff, I would need very strong evidence to diagnose the present patient as a manic depressive if we are already on the fence. I mean, if we have evidence both ways and we don't know what to call them, you can just look at it from a pure Bayesian standpoint and say, well, it's rational to bet schizophrenia. Although, of course, it is perfectly possible for a manic depressive gene to be floating around in that same family tree that hasn't surfaced for 2 or 3 generations, and the kid got that one rather than the schizo gene from mama. That's possible, statistically improbable. And if you think in terms of the frequency of that gene or genes in the population and stuff like that, you can easily figure it out. Saying almost nothing except the statistics is the point. So you'd say that's theoretical, but it's only itty-bitty theoretical. If you press the point, even the attribution of a trait is itty-bitty theoretical, isn't it? Otherwise, you wouldn't have some social psychologists saying there are no traits, only situations. I personally consider that a moderately psychotic remark, but there are people who say it. And whether they believe it about their friends, I find it hard to believe, but the people have said that. So if you say that, I mean, the short answer to that is if there are no traits, they're damn heritable, which is Kenny's answer. If there's no such thing as schizophrenia, okay, it certainly is inherited anyway. All right, so when I say theoretical, I don't mean to imply that there's a hard and fast line between theoretical and purely factual statements of a statistical nature, because the things that are in the statistics are almost always at least first-level summaries about behavior, and they are trait attributions which already involves a claim of some kind of statistical togetherness about episodes. I mean, that's what a phenotypic trait is. A phenotypic trait is a collection of lower-order dispositions which have certain common property and which are empirically covariant. That's the definition of a phenotypic trait. So that if something lacks either of those, then it's not a phenotypic trait. If it lacks if it lacks similarity in its content, lacks semantic resemblance, if you like, then it's a candidate for a genotypic theoretical inference. If it has common content but does not covary, then it's what Cattell calls a dictionary trait or a logical trait. Namely, it's in Webster, but it's not in the real world. And so one has to ask, well, what is the common characteristic of this related disposition family, and are they in fact covariant? And covariant can mean either in the sense of time, that is to say p correlation, or in the sense of individual differences, R correlation, which is the usual way of getting at it. Now, by a mechanical procedure of putting these data together, which I contrast with the clinical or informal procedure, I will accept anything that can be done practically by a clerk or a machine once the data are coded. So it doesn't necessarily mean a linear discriminant function or a multiple regression equation or a parabola, something nonlinear, or a term equation with cross products in it. It can mean a nomograph, which you look up this and run along here and then up here, and it says 73. It can be a computer program. It can be what Dave Licken called in one of his papers a function-free box. He and Dick Rose, I think it was, one of his PhDs, the behavior geneticist that some of you will know about, wrote a paper in which they took as their data some multiphasic stuff that I had been working on, and the argument was, look, we don't know what the function is like here, and even though we have a large n, we know that if you start putting in cross products, x1, x2 times log of x3 and things like that, HS score squared minus the cube root of depression plus PD times MA and so on with different beta weights. If you start playing that kind of games, of course, the capitalization on sampling errors becomes very bad in a hurry. In fact, if you've never computed the standard error of a beta coefficient for, say, a 5-variable prediction problem when it's all linear, you ought to do that once, and it'll curl your hair. It's really a very unstable business. So when we start taking higher powers and cross-product terms, it's a terrible mess mathematically. Licken's idea was, basically, he followed the kind of procedure that the Glucks followed in their prediction of delinquency, that you don't try to write a continuous function of the kind we're familiar with in the applied mathematics, x squared minus xy plus z and so forth. But what you do is you have some data that are qualitative and some that are quantitative, and the quantitative data you slice up so it becomes regions on the quantitative continuum, like skit score above 80, skit score between 70 and 80, skit score below 50, like that. And then that gives you anywhere from a dichotomy, say, to a tetratomy or quintectomy or something on each of your variables, and how fine you slice it can be determined on the basis of the distribution that you have, so that you don't slice something terribly fine that leads to having only 2 people in a cell. And what you end up then is with a hyperbox. That is, in a hyperspace of 10 dimensions, that's the multiphasic scales 1 through 0, each dimension either dichotomized or trichotomized. Then you have this hyperbox, and you do some sort of informal fooling around with the rate at which things fall off. But you're not making any big mathematical claims about that. That fooling around is the basis on which you decide where to draw cuts. And then this hyperbox, then, you'll see to it, you've drawn things so that every hypercell in the hyperbox has, say, at least 25 people in it. And you won't allow anything smaller than that. So some things will have to be cut quite coarse. You see, this will depend upon the joint multivariate distribution of the variables. And you've got some predictive outcome. Responds well or not to shock therapy, say. That's a dichotomous outcome. And you've tallied in each hypercell of the hyperbox so many people, patients, who were treated with shock and who had this kind of MMPI pattern formulated now in this goofy way. And then you simply, with a new patient comes along, and you say, well, he's in the top third of HS, and he's in the middle third of D, and MA or PA is very low validity key, and also has a low spread. You don't take care of spread by standard scores, remember, because the standard scores are based upon the normals, and there's a lot of top on depression, and there's very little top on scale 6, because it's only got 30 items. So that you've dichotomized. You've got plus or minus on scale 6. So everybody ends up with a configuration that places him in a box or cell of this hyperbox, and then you enter that from your previous actuarial experience. And if I'm in a cell that has a probability of 0.83 of responding to electroshock, then I get blitzed. Whereas if I have a probability of only 0.41, then I don't get blitzed. Okay, so that counts as a mechanical procedure. Now, I was a little careless when I wrote the book about the distinction between a mechanical procedure which is actuarial and one which is armchair. I don't understand how I could have been so sloppy about that, but I was. And it is important to make that distinction. Of mechanical or algorithmic prediction systems, you should distinguish between those that are literally based upon actuarial data. That is, with real live subjects in some clinical experience, in some population. Distinguish between that and a mechanical rule which isn't literally based upon computing any such statistics. That doesn't mean it's not based on some actuarial experience, but that experience has gone through the clinician's head. For example, if I didn't want to do a big fresh validity study on the MMPI for predicting response to group therapy in the VA mental hygiene clinic, I got other fish to fry research-wise, but I am converted by Meehl and others to thinking we should do this more efficiently than 15 people in a smoke-filled room gassing about it. So I could use something like the Delphi method. I could ask my local clinicians, when you decide whether a patient is a good risk for this kind of therapy, what do you think about? How do you do that? And I've got 15 MDs and PhDs and MSWs, and they all write down their little personal list of things they think about. And it turns out, if you have people do that, that there's a tremendous overlap among them. They've all gone to school and been brainwashed by Freudians, Jungians, or Skinnerians, or Rogerians, or something, and they've all seen a lot of patients, and they mutually reinforce each other's verbal behavior, and so the result is that there's a very high concordance in the things that they mention, and you could either be fussy or freewheeling about that. If you were fussy, you would give them all back the list of the things, including the other people's stuff and their own stuff, and ask them to rate from 1 to 9 or something how important you think this is. That saves you a meeting. That's the essence of the Delphi method. You get experts, but they can be all around the country, and they don't have to talk to each other. And you tell each expert what the other experts have been saying and ask him for a new judgment. So I end up with 7 things that these people think they use. Now, maybe they're full of beans that they don't even use them. There are a lot of data on that. Clinicians will mention things they look at. Turns out that they don't look at it at all. Or that they give something a lot of weight. You can show that they give something else more weight than they thought. And then there are other things that they use that don't work, that they shouldn't be using. But if you're not going to do a study, and if you're not going to extrapolate from somebody else's study, and you do want to proceed mechanically, then this is one way to do it. So you would put down these 7 things, and you would say, we're going to collect data now over the next 3 years, and some PhD in clinical is going to go into the files and give me the right weights. But for now, I'm going to use the clinician's own subjective weights. Relying on the evidence that suggests quite strongly, in more than one area, that relying on clinicians' weights applied mechanically will do better than relying on clinicians. It will not do as well as relying on actuarial weights, but it will do better than relying on clinicians. And I'll get to more of that, especially Goldberg's famous study later. All right, so this is a mechanical method that in some sense loosely is actuarial, but not in the narrow technical sense, because the actuarial background was filtered through the clinician's brains as expressed then in these ratings, and then I put the ratings together and I wrote the algorithm. That's different from an algorithm. It's literally based upon how many patients responded to shock or whatever. So the broad meaning is mechanical, and the narrow is actuarial. All actuarial prediction is mechanical, but not all mechanical prediction is actuarial. Now, I will anticipate an objection, because if it's hanging over your head, then all of the rest of what I'm going to say today will cause trouble with you. I'll come back to it, but saying it shortly. The first response that clinicians make when you start talking to them about this alternative way of making predictions is that they are interested in predicting for this individual and not for a group, and that actuarial prediction or mechanical prediction based upon some actuarial experience that you claim to have distilled into your nomograph is about groups, and that if you're a clinician, you are predicting not about groups, but about individuals. Now, I discussed that argument at some length. In fact, some people thought ad nauseam in the book and subsequent papers, so I'll send you there if you want to go into detail about it. I will try to handle it by 3 short concrete examples. Suppose that you are suffering from an illness which is quite unpleasant, although it may not be life-threatening, and you don't seem to be responding very well to the standard conservative treatments, and your physician says maybe you should have surgery for this thing. It's true, it doesn't always work, but it's pretty good treatment. Now, it's got a certain risk attached to it. You might die in the operating table, but and some people have the following bad side effects which we can't undo, but when it works like a charm. You'll be free of this condition. And you say to your doctor, well, how many people die in the operating table? Now, if the doctor said, why do you want to know that? You're a unique individual. You're not a group. Why are you asking me how many people? It's you we're talking about. I don't think you would receive that very well. You would think he was being evasive. Or if you said, okay, only 2% die on the operating table, you said it doesn't always work. How often does it work? If he said, you're a unique individual. We're talking about you, not a big bunch of people. I think you would think that doctor was a little bit muddle-headed, or that he didn't know the answer to your question. Or, for example, suppose you buy life insurance. Say you're a male who's married a woman who is not a career type and doesn't have a lot of occupational skills, and you have 4 children, and you get life insurance, and now you pay a certain premium to Prudential, and as I mentioned once before, it's perfectly rational for you to do that, but in the event that you live to be 103 and the wife and kids are all dead by then, you kind of got gypped. But you lost a bet with the insurance company, so to speak, and the state of Minnesota gets the money. and then the politicians will get it. But if you wouldn't say, if you're considering life insurance, and what premium should I pay, and should I buy term insurance in my situation, or insurance as a kind of savings, as some people do, and so forth. If the insurance man that's trying to peddle his fish were to keep telling you that it's stupid for you to ask about the life tables and how many people survive to start collecting their check because they haven't died in the meantime, if he kept fending off those questions by saying, we're talking about you, a unique individual, not about a group, again, you would think that was a pretty crummy way to reason. Or my third example, you've got to play Russian roulette. And the dictator of the universe says, now I'm going to make you play Russian roulette whether you want to or not. And here is this 6-shooter, and it's got 5 live shells in it, and 1 empty. And here's this one, it's got 5 empties, which is the way you play Russian roulette, and 1 live shell. Well, it is, and then what you do, you know, if you're a Russian nobleman in the days of the Tsar, after having 17 vodkas, why, you put this up and you spin the thing, and then you click. Well, actually, it's much safer than it sounds, because, of course, that shell has weight, and it tends to see to it that it's at the bottom, but not quite always. Now, suppose you were told by Hitler or somebody that you've got to do this, and if you're dead, you're dead, and if you're alive, why, he'll let you out of the concentration camp, okay? That's the deal. Now you get to choose which revolver you're going to use. Now, would you have a preference? And now suppose some clinician says, why would you have a preference? You're only going to do this once. You're only going to play, you don't go through the life playing Russian roulette. You're only going to do this once. Hitler's promised you he'll let you go if you survive this one trial of Russian roulette. You're never going to play it again. What is this business about statistics or odds? I don't think that any reasonable person would buy that. He would say, I'm going to play it with this with the safer gun, the one with the 5 empties. Well, you can get into very detailed philosophical analysis of that problem. It can be shortly formulated as the problem of applying a statistical frequency number to the individual case, which belongs to a larger class. Of course, the statistician who wants to defend an actuarial procedure is always interested in narrowing down the class by adding more information. And there's nothing about the actuarial method that says you use only an arbitrary subset of the facts you know. Every time you add another fact, you define another subclass. So if you want to predict my being alive a year hence, you would start, well, Caucasian male of Norwegian and Irish ancestry, what are the odds? Add college professor. Well, the odds of my living longer go up. It's a long-lived profession, almost as long-lived as clergymen. Well, I'll pass that. And then you add, however, the subject has a rheumatic heart lesion, because he had rheumatic fever at age 22, which kept me out of World War II. Now my odds go down. And then you're told, but the subject has no cardiac enlargement after all these years. Odds go up. And then you say, well, subject has a little bit of cardiac dysrhythmia. Odds go down. Easily controlled by quinidine 4 times a day. Odds go up. So that's what happens. What are we doing there? We're subsuming Meehl in this big bucket of individuals on which we have certain statistics of death. And now we add an attribute, and that we narrow the class, and then we add another attribute, and we narrow the class, or as the logicians would put it, by increasing the intension, we decrease the extension. That is, the more properties we pile on, the more we're whittling down the class. And you can continue to do that indefinitely until you get down to the unique individual, except that you don't get down to the unique individual with all of the factors that are relevant, because, of course, many of them are not known to you and not knowable. The rule that Reichenbach stated in 1938 is a simple one. In quality, quantitatively it's a little complicated. Take the smallest reference class for which you have stable frequencies. Now, the logicians and the statisticians have picked on that. That is, how stable. Stability of frequencies is a matter of degree. And it can get very complicated mathematically, and there are still debates going on about it. But as an overall qualitative remark, I don't know of any logician or statistician who would disagree. I mean, when you say add more information, you're getting closer to getting to the unique individual. If you're a determinist, then you think if you had all the information known to omniscient Jones, then you could predict for sure, so that your actuarial equation would still work peachy keen. It would give a value of 1.000. Now, you might ask which of these p-values is correct about Meehl. Reichenbach says they're all correct, but some of them are correcter than others, meaning the one that's based upon the smallest subclass for which you have stable frequencies is the one that you should rely on. Now, professionals, psychologists, psychiatrists, general physicians, lawyers, judges, social workers, parole boards, and stockbrokers usually take it for granted, even today, that the clinical or informal or impressionistic or case study way is the best way to do it. The great majority of people take that for granted, even in psychology. I sat on a couple of ad hoc committees appointed by Judge Lindsay Arthur when he was in the probate court. Juveniles charged with a serious offense, prosecutor wants to try them as an adult. A special board appointed by the judge, who I think has a BA or MA in psychology, and specified that the psychologist should be chairman of the panel, so I was. And then there was a parole officer, a probation officer, now they are both MSWs, a police officer, and a general citizen of the same racial extraction as the defendant. That was what the judge used to appoint. He used to do this for several months until the Supreme Court of Minnesota told him to quit. Anyway, we were going on the track record of this one kid, and the police officer didn't say very much, except that he had seen him in and out for 2 or 3 years. And the general citizen, this is a black kid, the black citizen representative said to the social worker, who was spinning on about whether he identified with his uncle and all that crap, and which is, it turns out not to predict anything. And so the black citizen representative finally interrupted the social worker and said, well, I don't know about all of that, but I know this kid. I've had dealings with him, and I'm prepared to say he's one real mean, tough kid that I don't want to meet in the dark. Well, he was going by the track record, you see. Well, I raised the question about the track record, and it turned out that neither of the two social workers, believe it or not, were aware that there was any controversy about clinical and statistical prediction. It wasn't just that they hadn't read Meehl's brilliant book, but they didn't know there was any issue. They both said it's obvious that you want to predict about this boy, you want to deal with him as an individual and understand his dynamics as an individual, and I said, no, it's not obvious, and so forth, but that didn't get anywhere. People will tell you that obviously you can predict better by understanding the individual. Obviously you can. It's just reflex with people to say that. Lay people will say that. Professionals will say that. Well, let's see what the situation is empirically. The first empirical study that compared two methods, the clinical method and the actuarial method, the first one I know of, and other people have done literature searches, and this apparently is the first one, was published in 1928, a long time ago. 1928, by the distinguished sociologist who wasn't distinguished yet at that time, E.W. Burgess. And Burgess was asked by the Illinois State Parole Board whether he could work out a system to improve their success in predicting who will violate parole. And so he had 3 Illinois state prisons a nice fat N of 1,000, so we don't have to fret about cross-validation. There are no beta weights being used here. And he, on the basis of his sociological armchair and on the basis of what social workers and police officers told him, he made a list of 21 factors that people thought were relevant to who violates parole. Nature of crime, length of sentence, father's nationality, county of indictment, this is typical of these things, size of community, type of residence, chronological age, and so forth. These were combined in an unweighted fashion, no fancy beta weighting, no optimal values, so everybody got a score of 1 to 21. And then on that basis, he tried to forecast who would violate their parole. And it turned out that the psychiatrists at the 3 prisons were inferior to Burgess's crude, non-optimal 21 actuarial system. There was the actuarial system was only slightly better than the psychiatrist if you took the cases for which the psychiatrist predicted, but he avoided predicting for a large fraction of the cases, whereas the actuarial method predicted all of them. So if you look at it from that standpoint, it was markedly superior, not just a little better. That dropped into the bottomless pit. Nobody paid any attention to it. Then we have a paper published by T.R. Sarbin. At the time he published it, he was in the counseling bureau here, although he was an Ohio State PhD. I think one of H.A. Toop's PhDs. I knew Ted Sarbin. He took as his prediction problem predicting honor point ratio in your freshman year of college. As you know, it's the freshman year that is the year of the great liquidation, although it isn't as bad as it used to be. These students had taken the college aptitude test, and they all, of course, had a high school rank expressed as a percentile. That's kind of interesting because that was a percentile, of course, of your high school. So whether you would be 90th percentile if you were in a 10-student graduating class at East Overshoe, whereas you might be at Washburn and be at 200. But that crude percentile placement in high school rank combined a 2-variable regression equation with college aptitude score. The beta weights were from a previous sample, so this was a cross-validation sample. Now, what the clinical counselors had, interviewing these freshmen as pre-freshmen, either when they were still in high school or were in their freshman week business, they had these 2 scores to look at, to use to whatever extent they wanted. But they also had a preliminary interviewer's notes, scores on the strong, scores on a 4-variable structured personality inventory, the Darley-McNamara, I think that was, an 8-page individual record form that the student filled out, like what your hobbies are and how many brothers and sisters you have and what magazines you take in the home and what does your old man do for a living and what about your mother, etc. Several additional aptitude and achievement tests, plus an hour interview. So the clinicians here had a great deal of information of both a documentary and psychometric character that the statistician did not have. He had only the 2 variables, plus the presumed benefits of a direct face-to-face interview with the real flesh and blood person. So how did the 2 methods do predicting? Analyzed separately for males and females because, as you know, in this type of situation, the females are almost always more predictable, anywhere from first grade to medical school and law school. It remains to be seen whether women's lib will get rid of that difference. I don't believe anybody has a really good theory. I have my personal theory as to why that's true, but in any case, it's always desirable to, in this type of task, to separate the sexes. The clinical prediction was 35 for men. The statistical was 45. Those are, as you know, typical figures for predicting college success from those two variables. Very typical that they're in the 40s. Maybe have declined a little bit in recent years because of the grade inflation phenomenon. For females, there was no difference. This difference is, of course, not significant. This is statistically significant, but it represents only 10 points. Well, Sarban was quite surprised by such a finding with all this additional information, both psychometric and interview data, and this 8-page personal form and stuff, that these two-variable regression equation cross-validated 10 points higher than the clinicians did. Well, nobody except me paid any attention to that one either. That's partly because Sarban had trouble getting it accepted by a psych journal. I wonder why. And so he had to publish it in the American Journal of Sociology, and they aren't in the grade prediction business, and so they didn't pay much attention to it, whereas the psychologists don't read the sociology journals, and so they had no occasion to even know it existed. When I was first lecturing on this, and I taught clinical psych back in 1944, I didn't know about the Sarban study until Art Brayfield, who was auditing the class, called my attention to it. Well, let me give you another one. Here we are in the area of psychopathology. Phyllis Whitman, clinical psychologist at the Elgin State Hospital in Illinois, developed a scale to predict response to shock therapy. As I mentioned last time, you don't like to give shock therapy if it ain't going to work for a number of reasons. And she had a rating system. Now I picked this one because the variables involved were to some degree subjective. They required a skilled clinician to make the rating. For example, anal versus oral character. That is not an objective trait. I personally believe in its reality, but I damn well can't prove it. Well, there's pretty good statistical evidence for something like the anal character, but I don't think it has anything to do with anal libido. In any case, there were these subjective things, but once the clinician had made the judgment, anal versus oral character type, then that, of course, could be coded 0 or 1. They weren't all like that. Some of them were, how long has the patient been ill? At what age did they have their first episode? Does the patient have hallucinations or delusions and things like that? She didn't do a true actuarial weighting either. This is mechanical, but it's the weights are based upon the relative importance ascribed to these in 50 studies by various authors. So in that sense, it's kind of actuarial in that they were studies rather than opinions. But she didn't, so to speak, colligate the percentages in any way. She just said, well, this seems to be important in most of the studies, so we'll give it a weight. There are judgments, despite the clinical subjectivity involved in things like anal versus oral, had high interjudge reliability. 2 clinical psychologists running an interjudge agreement at 0.87 on the scale scores. Okay. Similar predictions on a 5-step, similar predictions were made by the psychiatrists, not just one, the staff psychiatrists. And we then had, after shock had been administered, we had a judgment made at a staff conference, which, as she points out, undoubtedly biased the results somewhat in favor of the clinician because it included the same clinicians that had made the original judgments. They could have been swamped by others, but at least they were in the pot, so to speak. And I have put up there the summary of the results there. You have a 5-step criterion: remission, much improved, improved, slightly improved, and unimproved with shock. There's no category for got worse. These are the ends. This is the percent hits by the scale, and this is the percent hits by the psychiatrists. Here, the differences are much fatter than they are for Sarban's study. the scale beat the pants off the psychiatrists, you see. I mean, that's really a scandalous size difference, isn't it? These MDs thought they knew what they were predicting, but this scale worked a lot better. But keep in mind now, the first level data that were plugged in there before being coded were clinical judgments. What that kind of results suggest to some of us is that the optimal use of the clinician is at the interface with the patient, and then you take the decision-making away from him. We don't have a computer at this time that will be able to diagnose the paranoid walk. You know, they walk like they were in the storm troops. Anybody like that, the odds are 9 in 10 that they PA. You walk like this. A schizophrenic float, I am not too good at imitating that anymore. And the paranoid smile where they turn it on and off, but the eyes are not smiling, you know. Like Hitler smiling at the little kids when they'd come around. The hysteroid smile, sort of seductive, and the different, that's hard. Or the sleepy speech of the schizophrene. They often talk as if they were about sort of hardly awake, you know. And yet if you ask me, what is sleepy speech exactly? I don't know how to characterize it objectively. Well, first level classification of stuff like that is probably going to require clinical training, skill, and experience and natural talent for a long time. I mean, it's going to be hard for us to work out a computer program to get the hysteroid smile, I'll tell you that. They've been working on pattern recognition with computers for 30 years now, and they still haven't got programs that will recognize a slightly battered letter as well as the human brain will do it. So I assume that some of these clinical classifications at the first behavior level are going to be permanently something that's unique to the skilled, experienced clinician. That doesn't prove that he's any damn good at putting it all together. And one rationalization that the muddleheads have is since they know that the computer can't do that, they take it for granted that therefore the computer can't do the putting together as well as they can. And that's, of course, a completely different question. It may or may not be the case. Well, I'll give you one more study. This is from medicine. A student, Apostolakis, at Duluth, who took the clinical class from me years ago and then got to be chairman of psychology up there, got into a hassle with an internist named Martin, and they decided to do a study of diagnosing liver disease, strike that, jaundice. Now, the two main kinds of jaundice are, that aren't connected with something like malaria, are mechanically based, where the bile gets backed up because of a constriction in the gall duct, or an inflammatory process, or a gallstone. And the other kind is parenchymal liver disease, such as hepatitis, early cirrhosis, and carcinoma of the liver. Now, the treatment of choice for obstructive jaundice is surgery. Whereas, this is before they were shattering gallstones with that sound business. If you operate a person with parenchymal jaundice on the misconception that he has obstructive jaundice, you will increase the mortality by 10 to 15%. It's a pretty serious mistake for the surgeon and the internist to make. Well, the question is, can you make that differential diagnosis actuarially? And they had a two-variable cross-validated regression equation. The two variables were two biochemical indicators from blood. I forget what they were. The physician, the clinician, was given these same two scores, which are generally known to be very powerful but not infallible, plus reading the chart with all of the other stuff in it, the presenting complaints and the course and things like that. So he had more information, but the information he had included this two-variable thing. How did that work out? Well, boarded internists did about 8% better than the equation. General practitioners did slightly worse. I kind of like that one. So the problem is not just in predicting behavior. It arises in predicting organic disease and in a variety of other contexts. Now, my book had, however feeble an impact on clinical practice, essentially zero. Did have an impact on PhD dissertations. And so after 1954, a lot of people got into the act and began sitting up and taking notice and doing studies of this. And a lot of them were people who were clinicians, desirous of showing that clinicians can beat out the actuary. I did a study of 29 clinicians reading MMPI profiles and comparing the 29 clinicians, which included Hathaway and Rosen and Meehl and people, if anybody knows how to read Maltz, we did, I assume, and compared these 29 clinicians diagnosing psychosis versus neurosis. That was the dichotomous task we had, comparing that with 6 different statistical methods. A discriminant function, linear discriminant function, Likken's actuarial box, the Meehl-Dahlstrom rules, a complicated mess if you have ever looked at them, the Talby-Sisson signs, and a couple of others. And it turned out that the actuarial method beat out the average clinician. It beat out the pool judgment of the 29 clinicians. It beat out all of but one, I think, of the individual clinicians. The top, I gave prizes for this loathsome task. And the top clinician, I think, was a little better than the best actuarial method, but not significantly better in terms of percent hits. That best clinician, at that time a graduate student in clinical psych, was Alex Caldwell of the Caldwell MMPI reports that come out of California, if you can afford them. By a few years later, it was possible to pull together 35 studies. In my book, I only had 18 or 20. And then a few years later, something like 65 analyzed by Sawyer. And the most recent breakdown is by Will Grove, who used a classification system of predictive domains that I had developed earlier: academic, occupational, criminal, mental health or personality, violence, suicide, rehabilitation, neuropsychology, whether the patient has a brain tumor from the psychometrics, and other. And now we have the statistical doing better than the clinical. Here this means now either actuarial or broadly mechanical. So these are not all actuarially based. Stat approximately equal to clinical, and stat better than clinical. 7, 5, 0, 6, 1, 0, 1, 0. I'm sorry, I'm giving you the data for where the studies for where the data are psychological tests only. I'll give you the others in a minute. That's how it is when the data are psychological. He thought it would be a good idea to see what would happen if you isolated those in which the raw data were nothing clinical in the usual sense, but were just psychometrics.
Is the last column stat less than clinical?
Stat better than clin, yeah.
The first one's stat better than clinical.
Stat less than. This means predicting grades in school, law school, graduate school, dental school, Air Force Academy, Coast Guard, Navy washout, stuff like that. This means success as an insurance salesman, or whether you'll get fired from your job for not being able to learn the stuff. This is crime, delinquency, including pre-delinquents, people who haven't yet fallen in trouble, as in the Gluck studies. Mental health and personality, that means things like maladjusted versus adjusted for college students, or personality characteristics generally, such as Q sorts of normal range personality things. Violence and suicide's obvious. Rehabilitation after a stroke or whatever. Neuropsychology, does the patient have a tumor? Other, well, here there weren't any studies that did that, but it means other oddball things like rating nurses as to their fear of mental patients from the MMPI. Well, as you can guess, the 4 9s tend not to be afraid of patients. And if you just use a crude coding of that, you do better than having Hathaway or Butcher look at the thing and make a judgment. Now, pooling all the studies, 80 studies, where you allow the clinician or the statistician to have not only psychometrics but other stuff. We have 7, 4, 5, 11, 1, 2, 7, 4, 5, 11, 1, 2, 1, 1. What am I doing? I'm sorry. I've forgotten a category here. That, I guess, wasn't on the other one. Medical, neuropsych, and other. So it is 2, 2, 1, 1. Other here is things like predicting which football team will win. One of Norm Garmezy's PhDs, when Garmezy was still at Duke, compared the actuarial prediction of football game outcomes with those of coaches in the league and sports writers. And the equation beats out the experts. 6, 4, 5, 14, 4, 2, 3, 2, 3, 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, 1, 1, 0, 0. So on the overall thing, the stat better than the clinical method, percent 42%, for stat and clinical approximately equal, 54%, and for stat inferior to the clinical method, 4%. Now, them's pretty strong figures. As I point out in my Toronto talk, it's really difficult to come up with a controversy in the social sciences in which the data pile up that uniformly in one direction. As you know, in the social sciences, they usually go all over the place, and you can explain some of the discrepancies and not others. To have that kind of a box score over this range of different predictive tasks would suggest that something pretty strong and pervasive is operating here, and that the human mind is not an efficient assigner of beta weights and is not an efficient user of beta weights once assigned. Grove is currently doing a real fancy meta-analysis, and we have developed a set of categories for the meta-analysis, like predictive domain, kind of data, experience of the clinician, what degree the clinician has, MD, PhD, whatever. And he has got up to 120 or 125 studies and figures that he will be hitting 150 before he's through. So far, it continues to look substantially as it did when he built that table back in, I think, 3 years ago. The problem is obviously not purely academic, although it's fascinating methodologically as to why this should be true. You can think of concrete circumstances in which a combination of inferior predictive percentages with extreme social cost is a very bad thing to have happening. Now, I'll give you just one example of that. In court services, they have a whole army of social workers that write these long reports that I had alluded to before, the so-called PSI, pre-sentence investigation. And the judge, if you've ever been down to court, it's really funny because the judge sits up there and he's got this PSI bound there, and he's sort of flipping through it the way you do waiting for the dentist and with the magazine. He doesn't read them with care except in a rare case that's got high visibility for a bloody axe murder or something. And I figured out once, having read a series of them myself in connection with some litigation, that the judge couldn't possibly read them. I mean, he wouldn't have time in the working week. He couldn't do any judging. And but it takes an awful lot of tax money because you got this army of social workers with their automobiles and all the stenographers, and they rocket around and they talk with the scoutmaster and ask whether the kid identified with him and how was he good with tools and did he like birds and all this crap, and then they put this into this big dossier and they spin it out and it goes on and on and on and on and on. And as I say, the judge doesn't really pay much attention to it, which is very fortunate, because if he did, his predictive accuracy would probably decline significantly. In the state of Minnesota, it doesn't matter much because we have these guidelines. And the guidelines idea was inspired partly by sociologists who were familiar with the state of the controversy and who realized that the differences between judges involved elements of inefficiency in judgment plus extreme injustice. That is, if you get before Judge Glotz for DWI, you'll get clobbered, whereas Judge Fisby is particularly hard on sex. And here's somebody else who has a thing about petty thievery. And the statistics on different sentences have shown that the injustice involved in that is great. And as I say, apart from injustice, it's just that judges don't make very good judgments. But if they paid much attention to these big documents that are being submitted, they become worse than they are. With predicting parole violation or criminal recidivism, the studies have been shown over and over again with many different countries. Sweden, Germany, Italy, Australia, United States, that there's a standard set of a half a dozen things. If you want to know whether this guy will go out and rob another bank next week or in the next 2 years, there's certain things you want to know. How many crimes has he committed? That's how many he's been convicted of. That's a proxy for how many he's actually committed. Most crimes, as you know, are never attached to the person who did them. The great majority, if you work it out, gets down to only about 5 or 10%. How many crimes? Some studies would indicate seriousness, others not. At what age? Somebody that steals a little gum at age 7 is not in the same boat as somebody who sticks a switchblade into an old lady at age 7 to get her purse, you know. How far did the person go in school? Something about what the sociologists call horizontal mobility. People who move around a lot are poorer risks than people who stay in the same place. Does the person have a chemical dependency problem? What are the associates? The sociologists emphasize that a lot, so they frequently show. That is, does he hang around with other street kids or does he not? What's the longest time this person has ever been employed in the private sector in the same job? That's a negative predictor of recidivism or parole violation. That's, in some studies, IQ. The only psychometrics I would be inclined to stick in there, even though I'm a psychologist, not a social worker, is the Q score on the Porteous, which has been shown in a number of studies to be predictive. Not the IQ from the Porteous, but the quality score as an indicator of poor impulse control and lack of foresight. Maybe the MMPI, it doesn't cost much. Not the Rorschach and the TAT, or the draw person, or the Jandi. Now, this is the same set of factors that's predictive in Bucharest or Milwaukee. There are some things you can't predict, you would go by the base rate. But the studies show that when you can predict better than flipping a coin or going by the base rate, it's this same standard list of stuff over and over and over again. And all this other stuff doesn't add anything. So when you think of it, here you got all this tax money being spent by this army of social workers writing these fat dossiers that His Honor doesn't have time to read, which, as I say, it's fortunate because if he did, his accuracy would probably decline. Now, there are numerous studies, both in organic medicine and in psychology and psychiatry, and in predicting success, for example, in graduate work, that show that you can lower the individual clinician's ability to predict by giving him more data. It's not just that the clinician doesn't do as well as the equation does, but given how the clinician does, if you give him a lot more stuff, he starts doing worse. The first time I know that to have been shown was by Kelly and Fisk in their big study of VA training program in clinical psych. If you want to predict whether somebody will get his damn PhD in 5 years in the VA training program, you want to know his Miller analogy score. Today we would use the GRE. Miller analogies, undergraduate grades, the theoretical score of the Allport-Vernon as a positive predictor, the religious score of the Allport-Vernon as a negative predictor, and throw everything else in the wastebasket. What they did when they had these clinicians making predictions from a subset of the data, and then they gave them Slapsy Maxie Hutt's reading of the Bender Gestalt and so-and-so's Rorschachs, and then they had them come to a cocktail party and watched what they did after a martini, and then they had them do some OSS stuff where you have 4 people have to build a bridge and the stuff doesn't work and like that. And they gave the clinicians all this additional information. Their predictive ability declined. Why should that surprise anybody? Why should that surprise anybody? It's overload. The brain can't process all that stuff. The idea that in your head you do some brilliant Einsteinian synthesis of all this is a bunch of baloney. And what you do is start taking off weight from the beta weights that ought to be there. You start plugging in stuff that does not have any predictive value. So it didn't surprise me when I read the Kelly study, and studies since then. A sizable amount of research is accumulated to say that the mind can't process this much stuff. And if you give people only the things that have high beta weights objectively, they will do better than if you give them that stuff plus some other stuff that they have to somehow integrate with this. The interesting thing in the Sarbin analysis was that the clinicians thought they were making use of all this other information, but it turned out that you could predict their predictions from the 2 variables better than they could predict the truth of the matter. Now that brings me to another interesting angle, a classic study by Lou Goldberg of Oregon Research Institute, in which he reanalyzed the Meehl-Dahlstrom data on my 29 local experts. Also showed that a simple unweighted linear equation of the multiphasic could do better than the Meehl-Dahlstrom rules, which I think I told you once before is somewhat distressing considering how hard we worked making them. He did the following interesting thing. He took these clinicians' judgments about neurosis and psychosis. I had them rate on an 11-step scale. I said, if you think it's a matter of degree, then that's what this is. If you think neurosis and psychosis is not a matter of degree, but a difference in kind, then the rating is your confidence as to what bucket the person goes in. Take it either way. And so we had these 11-step ratings, and he took the clinicians' predictions on this 11-step scale and assigned the beta weights to the multiphasic scores with the clinician's predictions as the thing to be predicted, as the criterion variable. Then he took those regression equations that were not predicting the truth of the matter about the patient, but were predicting what the clinician would say on an 11-step scale, and he used that regression equation to predict about the patients. And guess what? He beat out the clinicians. Paradoxical, but after the fact easy to understand. The clinician not only assigns non-optimal betas, but he does not apply them consistently. So that you can extract the betas from him in some average sense of what his brain computes, and then you proceed to apply them consistently, and you beat him out. That was a really cute study. I thought that's a clever thing that Goldberg did. Well, one of the things that makes people bristle about this is that the whole procedure is so atheoretical. And for a clinician, say with my Freudian leanings, that is mildly disturbing, because I like to think that I know something about the mind from reading Freud and from having an analysis and things like that, and from treating a lot of patients over the years. The equation doesn't make use of any theoretical structure. It deals with things at the first level, or coded one level up. The theory might dictate what variables you try out, but theory isn't in there the way it is in physics or chemistry. You're trying to make a new compound, and you ask, well, what's the valence of this, and that kind of question. Well, there you have to remember how theory works in the developed sciences. In order to make predictions by means of a theory, you have to have a theory that has high verisimilitude, and that means that it takes account of most, if not all, of the powerful variables. And you have to have an accurate instrumentation for assessing those variables, for measuring them. The reason that physics and chemistry do well in astronomy and genetics using theory is that they have a strong theory, a good theory, a theory that isn't perfect but has high verisimilitude, and they have measuring devices so that they can say x1 is this and so much, plus or minus a small error, and x2 is this, and x3 is that, and the theory specifies the mathematical equation into which those x's get plugged. In clinical psychology, in counseling psychology, in social work, in community psychology, in delinquency and stuff like that, we do not meet either of those two conditions, do we? We do not have a powerful, high verisimilitude, validated theory, and if we did, we still are in the boat that we have highly fallible measurement of the variables that are involved. So it shouldn't be surprising to you that the addition of theoretical reasoning over and above the first-order empirical relationships of the facts does not add a heck of a lot. Now, we're not the only science that's in that boat. There's a controversy going on, I understand. I haven't read the recent literature on this now, so I may be a little out of date, but I read some of the older stuff, and in meteorology. The meteorologists, some meteorologists saying that they should make the maximum amount of use of theoretical comprehension of things about clouds and anticyclones and stuff like that, and other meteorologists saying, look, you don't have quick enough access to enough different spots around Montana at a given time, even with modern computers, to use the theory profitably that way, and so you should proceed. You should use the theory, which is based upon general physics and chemistry, of course, mostly physics and geology. You should use the theory to be sure that you put the variables in that are relevant, and you should use the theory to suggest possible general function forms in the mathematics of prediction. But when it comes down to actually trying it out, that's a curve-fitting problem, and the prediction in the individual weather place ought to be done actuarially rather than by theory. Well, I don't know the current state of that debate. My point there is simply that it isn't only because we're dealing with the mind or with society that we're in trouble using theory. Any case in which the theory is not sufficiently detailed, or in which your ability to get accurate measures in time of the state of the system to plug into the theoretical equations is going to have the same problem that the clinical psychologist or the social worker or the psychiatrist or the probation officer has. The case that troubles a lot of people if they contemplate proceeding actuarially in clinical practice or even in selecting graduate students is the case in which the actuarial algorithm totally omits a factor which, when present, is extremely potent. So potent that it countervails all of the other factors that you have put into your equation. It's kind of interesting when you write a book or an article on a controversial matter, the extent to which people get dyslexia. People keep bringing that up as if it was a thought that had never passed through P.E. Meehl's head. And I'm not a dumb person, and of course it passed through my head, and it's discussed in the book, and it's known by people who can read as Meehl's broken leg. The example I give is of somebody, say a sociologist interested in entertainment theory, who has got an equation for predicting whether somebody will go to, a certain college professor will go to the movies this Friday night. And he may have actuarial data on that individual, which would be preferable. Absent that, he may have group data. So he knows that this person is a psychologist rather than a Romance language professor, and that he's such and such an age, and his marital status, and whether he has children, and what section of the city, and what books he reads, and blah, 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 like that. So he puts, the statistician plugs all this stuff into this equation, whether it's an idiographic equation based on studying me or one based upon the study of a group of people. And he arrives at the probability of 0.83 that I'll go to the movies this Friday night. So that's pretty good betting odds. And then he is informed that I have just broken my leg in a skiing accident, and I got my cast up to here. Now, at that point, of course, he completely washes out the prediction. People who are in a hip cast after a one-day-old busted leg, let's make it a femur, do not go to the movies. And so all of this other stuff that's in the equation goes by the board, quite appropriately. And as I say, I'm not so dumb as not to have considered that case, and it's a very interesting case to consider. The broken leg problem. David Faust of Rhode Island Hospital is currently doing a big study. He's a neuropsychologist and is doing a big study in which I'm a consultant on the extent to which neuropsychologists benefit from the broken leg case. What is the broken leg case in general? It's a factor which, either due to inadvertence or rarity, was not in the actuarial equation. Now, I point out in the book that a hard-nosed actuary might say, well, if it's so damn rare, I'm not going to worry about it. But that's a mistake, because a sum of things which are quite rare can add up to, say, 5 or 10%. And if you're talking about being in prison or getting killed or having shock therapy, 5 or 10% is not trivial. So an extremely rare event that belongs to a set of events which are quite qualitatively diverse, but any one of which would countervail the equation, could add up to a sizable percentage. Well, now, what's the state there? You have to be able to know when you've got a broken leg case if this is going to pay off for you as a practitioner. The first level judgment of the practitioner in countervailing the equation is that he has a broken leg case before him. Now, in the case of a broken leg and somebody going to the movies, it's easy to decide that. I mean, look, it's easy to say that somebody has a busted leg with high interjudge reliability, and without any systematic research, there's a well-established common sense proposition that people with broken legs do not show up with their leg in a cast in the movies. And so you don't need a systematic actuarial study to do that. So when you've got something easily identified and which cuts across predictive tasks in this way, it would be predicting whether he'd go to the movies, predicting whether he'd go dancing, predicting whether he'd go skiing. I mean, you know, a whole bunch of things, all of which involve the concept of mobility of the human body, right? And so there's a lot of things you can rule out. If the clinician can identify the broken leg case when he has one, it will pay for him in the long run to do that. But if that's true, then in the long run, he should beat out the equation. I mean, that's high school algebra, isn't it? That's not a matter of theory or your theory of the mind or anything. If you have the subset of cases in which the equation and the clinician make the same prediction, they'll have exactly the same hit rate. So if their hit rates differ, it'll only be for the cases in which they say the opposite. One says yes, one says no. If the broken leg cases are being correctly identified by and large over the long run, it means that the clinician is departing from the equation due to his ability validly to spot broken leg cases. In that subset of cases, he will beat out the statistician. Since they're the same in the cases where they agree, and since he'll beat out the statistician where they disagree, it follows, 9th grade algebra, that over the long pull he should do better, which he doesn't. Conclusion, he must not be able accurately to identify the broken leg case. He must think he has broken leg cases when he doesn't. Because if he knew when he had them, then he would have to do better. And when that was pooled with the cases where they say the same thing, then overall he would do better, which he does not. Practical suggestion from that. If we admit the concept of the broken leg case, which it would be foolish of us to deny, even me, with my views, one of the possibilities here is to train clinicians to have a higher threshold for broken leg cases, to be more self-critical as to when they have a datum that is not in the algorithm that should countervail the equation. And in that situation, if we had clinicians trained to be more self-critical so that their threshold for, broken leg case was higher, then it might be that they would eke out superior predictions. But in order to do that, you have to educate them first up to the point of realizing that they are not doing very well, which turns out to be a damn near impossible task. I mean, this problem has been around since 1928, and the research literature continues to accumulate, and periodically somebody like Sawyer or Sines or Harrison Goff or David Faust now writes another paper updating it. They had symposia every few years at the APA, to which, needless to say, I was always invited, and the first couple of 3 times I went, and then I got tired of hearing the same dumb arguments over and over again, so I started to decline and say, why don't you ask my student Henry Glotz to show up? He knows my views. But as I say, it has negligible impact upon the way clinicians proceed, or upon the way administrators think, or upon the way clinical psychology programs operate. So far as I can make out, the vast majority of clinicians still take it for granted that putting it together in their head is the best way to do it. So, as the end of the paper, my Toronto speech says, I have adopted a somewhat Buddhistic attitude towards this. I can only be mildly irked periodically and remind myself that God did not put me in the position of having to fix the universe, which I decided at age 14 was an impossible task anyway, and not a wise thing for anybody to attempt. I can mainly get irritated with it when I realize that harm is being done to patients or to juvenile delinquents or to the victims of criminals. And as a taxpayer and former libertarian, card-carrying libertarian, I can be quite exercised to think of all the tax money that's going into these useless pre-sentence investigation reports. And no possibility of changing that, you see. I mean, the structure of society. Can you imagine going down convincing the local bureaucrats to get rid of all that junk? Can you imagine anybody being insane enough to think that you could make even a tiny dent in why? I mean, you might as well try it in the Soviet Union. So I am not interested in trying to fix the world, but I persist in writing papers from now and again just to see whether my colleagues are as intractable as they were 30-some years ago. I do have some faith, and I have to call it faith because I don't have any hard evidence on this. I do have some faith that if you could train clinicians to raise their threshold, and so that the last step in the system would be the clinician overviewing, so to speak, and he had a high threshold for the broken leg case, that I think at least good, well-trained clinicians could start beating out the actuary. But it's damn slim pickings to find them so far. Grove is coming up, he thinks, with perhaps a half a dozen to a dozen out of 140 or 50, and they are mostly in medicine, which is very interesting. Very interesting if that turns out to be a significant trend of them. And we maybe won't have a big enough N of that in the meta-analysis to show whether it's significant. I have a theory about that. If that should turn out to be true, that the physician doing organic medicine, not the psychiatrist now, he's even worse than the psychologists are apparently, but the physician doing organic medicine, in some diseases, the state of theory is such that thinking about it in causal theoretical terms it perhaps pays off. Did I ever tell you my glutamic monosodium glutamate example? All right, well, that's kind of leads me to think about this possibility. My former physician, now retired, unfortunately, Howard Horns, who used to be assistant dean of the medical school, came over one night, he lives near me, to look at my strep throat to see whether we should give me the right kind of pills. Because if you have a rheumatic heart lesion, you do not want to get subacute bacterial endocarditis. And he said, well, Paul, I'm going down to Idle now, and I'm going to fill a guy full of accent. Didn't I tell you this before? And I said, Howard, what the hell are you talking about? He said, well, I got this guy, this patient, and we don't know what the hell is the matter with him. I mean, I don't know what he's got, but he's got something real bad in his liver. And we've got a lot of the blood chemistry, and this fellow's going to die within the next 24, 48 hours if we don't do something. And I have figured out from the chemistry that whatever is the cause of what's going on in him, if I fill him full of monosodium glutamate, I will get a proper kind of, I forget, buffering or whatever the biochemistry is involved here, against what it is that's going on in his blood. And hope that this is autocatalytic doing feedback, making the liver thing worse, since we don't know what's the matter with his liver anyway. What can we lose? He said, I'm going to tell him I never did this before, but you may die of this. So the next time I saw Howard Horns, MD, I said, what happened to that guy with the accent? Oh, we fixed him. Fixed him all right. He says, of course, we didn't get an autopsy as a result of that, so we don't know what's the matter with the guy's liver. Now, my Dr. Howard Horns I picked partly because I had known him since we were freshmen. I was a freshman, B.A. summa cum laude in psychology, advisor Patterson, intended to go into psychiatry, so he majored in psychology. Then when he saw the psychiatry service, he decided to hell with that stuff and went into internal medicine. But he was one very smart man. I mean, I happen to know his Miller score is in the high 90s raw, which means 180 IQ, see. Now, the point is, if you had this man's liver disease and you fell into the clutch of Henry Glotz, Sawbones, M.D., without Howard Horn's IQ, you probably would have died, because he wouldn't have been thinking about giving you accent, see. Or if he did, he'd be too damn rigid. He'd say, well, this is not a treatment of choice that's known from the literature. But Howard Horn's uses a rational decision policy. Like when I have a sore throat, he doesn't want to take a throat culture, because if you've got rheumatic heart disease, you don't want to wait 24 hours for the bugs to get in there, and then you're in the soup. So no matter what the cause, he's likely to say, put me on tetracycline right away. That's a rational decision rule. You got a patient who's going to die, you don't know what he's got, and you don't have any steps to find out what he's got in terms of the etiology. What have you got to lose by giving him monosodium glutamate? I mean, he'll get accent poisoning is all, but he's going to die anyway. So this is somebody thinking about the theory in causal terms and coming up with something that's not in anybody's equation. Now, that doesn't mean it never could be in any equation, but it wasn't at that time, you see. So I have faith and hope, perhaps irrationally, that if we can once get clinicians, hit them over the head with a meat axe enough times to realize how fallible they are, and then tell them, here's the equation, this is what you should be mostly going by, but if you have very good reasons to countervail it, do so. People have asked me now, come on, Paul, when you go to for a physical and you've got some illness, are you telling me that you would just as well that guy, MD, be making the decisions by an actuarial equation? My answer is, if one exists, and if I don't have something very exotic, I would prefer it. So I believe in my own doctrines. I would prefer to have it done actuarially. I've worked with physicians over the years enough to know that if you believe that because Dr. Kildare has that white coat on, that he approaches papal infallibility, you are living in one big dream world. I mean, you go to a case conference, they don't even think of all the possibilities that they should be thinking of. My attitude there is average random sawbones out of the yellow pages. I'd rather have it done actuarially any day. But now, if I've got something a little fancy, then if my physician is Howard Horn's MD with his 180 IQ, then I would like him to do it. But I would like him to look at the equation first, and one of the reasons I liked him is that he frequently gave me percentages. He frequently gave me percentages. The average sawbones doesn't give the percentages to the patient, and it's hard to extract them if you ask. He routinely used to do that, tell people. Not just to me. I asked relatives of mine who were not educated people. I asked my grandmother. She says, he's the first doctor that I ever really liked and trusted. I said, right, you're right. He would give her percentages. With her third-grade education, she knew what odds meant, you know. So that's my notion that if you can fix up the clinician so he has a little more humility about his skills, then we can plug him in at the end. Now, there is one common statement that is made that really gets my blood pressure up, because I've answered it 37 times in the literature. When people say, oh, you fellas shouldn't be fomenting this awful dichotomy, the two methods complement each other and they should be used hand in hand. That's one of Anastasi's dumber remarks. Now, when two methods lead to the opposite answer, you don't use them both, right? I mean, if the clinician says give him shock and the equation says don't give him shock, you don't give him 100 milliamps somewhere in between. It's like Kendall in his statistics book. He said, you got people, he said, I don't understand it if somebody says the Earth rotates from east to west and somebody else says it rotates counterclockwise. You can always find a few people who will say it's something in between. It's not something in between. I mean, if the two methods always gave the same answer, then you'd dispense with the clinician because he costs more. If they don't always give the same answer, then you have to decide which answer you're going to follow. And in that sense, you can't, quote, do both. So that the question is whether we allow the clinician to be the last stage operator, whether we allow him to do the broken leg job of countervailing. On the present evidence, we usually shouldn't, at least in the behavior prediction areas. In medicine, it remains to be seen. We don't have enough studies there yet. One final argument that one hears, which I refuse to take seriously, is when people tell me, look, Paul, people have been making decisions about, in medicine, they've been making decisions about where to dig for oil, they've been making decisions about where to invest your money in a pension fund, all these years proceeding the other way. Now, that argument is a nothing as far as I'm concerned, unless you know how well those decisions are going, right? How well does your broker predict the stock market? I got predictions from one of these chart and figure guys for 1 year, free, giving me a summary of his predictions, I mean, and he showed at the end of a year if I had slavishly done what he said, I would have been something like 16% ahead of, made that much profit. It was a year that the market was just slopping around, whereas I was in a mutual fund that at the end of the year, had I sold out, I would have had a 12% loss. So that makes a 28% difference between the clinical judgment of these guys sitting around the smoke-filled room and the actuarial method. The fact that physicians have been using clinical methods all these centuries doesn't tell me anything about whether that's a highly accurate way of doing it. The base rate, the predictive accuracy against post-mortem of general medical practice is only something like 60 to 70% hits. Maybe some of you didn't know that. When I was an intern at the University Hospital, they just finished a study on neurology. It's true, these were selected patients, namely they all died or came to surgery, so they had tissue to look at. Outpatient, out-of-the-state diagnoses by the local practitioner GP of neurological diseases was only running something like 65 or 70% correct. Diagnosing between multiple sclerosis and Guillain-Barré's disease and cerebellar tumor and tabes dorsalis and so forth. So I give no weight to the argument people have been making judgments all this way, all these centuries on some other basis, because they've also been inventing superstitions about black cats and witches and four-leaf clovers, etc., all these centuries on a clinical basis. And I'm not going to have time to read you my scare case of retrolental fibroplasia. Suffice it to say, there are many thousands of people, adults now, who are totally and incurably blind because obstetricians and pediatricians were giving huge doses of oxygen to newborns who were preemies. And the big argument was based upon clinical experience as to whether this was or was not a good thing. And it's only when somebody sat down and did the actuarial data, it was concluded that all these people that got blind were being blinded by the obstetrician and pediatrician. And that's not 12th century I'm talking about. That happened in the 1940s. Pneumothorax, that horse needle that collapses your lung to make it rest. Howard Horns tells me he's convinced that that ever had any validity, but they were doing it. The use of the bedpan, which has practically ceased to exist in hospitals now, and which is thoroughly unpleasant for all parties, was not based upon any good data until some got an MA in nursing and proved that it did more harm than good to the patient's blood pressure, not to mention their morale and their bowel movements. So they quit doing it. The only way you find out whether this stuff works is to collect some data. And the notion that because Henry Glotz has an MD or PhD and MSW and has seen a lot of people, Therefore, you must have faith in what he thinks is true, is a notion that we really shouldn't believe in. God forbid you should think that I don't think you learn anything by contact with patients. I'll give you some propaganda on that when we meet again next quarter. But the argument, people have not usually done it this way, is only a valid argument if you've got some comparative data to show that the way they've been doing it is a good way to do it. And stockbrokers and physicians and social workers, what's the evidence? Okay.